Hello, guys. Let's dive deeper into the forgotten Wild West.
Nobody in Caldwell Creek had ever seen Rosalie Harrington cry. Not when her mother passed. Not when the drought took half their land. Not even when her father sat her down at the kitchen table one cold Tuesday morning and told her she had 3 days to become another man's wife. She didn't cry then either. She just set down her coffee cup very slowly and stared at the knot in the wooden table like it owed her an explanation. Her father, Gerald Harrington, was not a bad man. That was the hardest part. He was simply a man who had borrowed more than he could return, from a lender who had run out of patience. The debt was substantial. 4 years of bad harvests, 1 failed cattle deal, and a medical bill that had quietly swallowed what little savings remained. Walter Cobb, the man Gerald owed, had made the arrangement clear. The debt would be forgiven in full. All it required was 1 signature, 1 ceremony, and 1 daughter. The man's name was Clayton Moore. Rosalie had heard the name once before, maybe twice, in the way you hear names that don't concern you. He owned land north of town. Kept to himself. Wasn't known for trouble, but wasn't known for warmth either. That was the full extent of what she knew about the man she would marry on Friday. She spent those 3 days doing what she always did when something felt unbearable. She worked. She mended fence posts. She hauled water. She kept her hands moving so her mind wouldn't settle long enough to feel the full weight of what was coming. Her younger sister, Janelle, sat on the porch steps the evening before the wedding, watching Rosalie stack firewood with more force than necessary. "You don't have to pretend it's fine," Janelle said quietly. "I'm not pretending anything," Rosalie said, without stopping. "You haven't said a single word about him." "There's nothing to say." Janelle was quiet for a moment. "Daddy feels terrible." Rosalie set down a log. She looked at her sister, then at the house behind her, then at the flat stretch of land that had demanded so much from all of them for so long. She picked up another log. "I know he does," she said. "That's why I'm doing it." Quote, the ceremony was short. A small church, a handful of witnesses, and a preacher who seemed to sense that nobody in the room needed a long sermon. Rosalie wore her mother's dress, altered the week before by a neighbor woman who hadn't asked questions. She was grateful for that. Clayton Moore was taller than she'd imagined, broad across the shoulders, with weathered hands and a face that looked like it had spent most of its life outdoors. He wasn't unkind looking. He wasn't anything, really. He was simply a stranger standing at the front of a church, waiting for a woman he didn't know to walk toward him. He didn't smile when she reached him. Neither did she. When the preacher asked if she took this man, she said yes the way a person says yes to something inevitable. Clear, flat, final. Clayton said his vows in a low, even voice, and she noticed he didn't look away from her once during the whole thing. She couldn't decide if that made her more or less comfortable. There was no celebration after. No dancing, no cake, no toasts. Gerald hugged her at the door and held on a moment longer than usual. She patted his back twice and stepped away before he could say anything she'd have to respond to. Clayton's wagon was waiting outside. He helped her up without a word, then climbed up beside her. They rode north in silence for nearly 20 minutes before he spoke. "I had the back room cleared out," he said. "It's yours. I won't trouble you." She looked straight ahead at the road. "Good." Another long silence. "There's a garden on the east side," he added. "It hasn't been tended in a while. You can do what you want with it." Quote. She didn't answer that time. And he didn't try again. The house was plain, but well kept, larger than she'd expected. There were small things she noticed without meaning to. A row of books on a shelf near the fireplace, a coffee tin that had been scrubbed clean, curtains that someone had once chosen with care. She didn't know what to make of any of it. That first night, she sat on the edge of the bed in the back room and listened to the silence of a house that wasn't hers, in a life she hadn't chosen, beside a man she didn't know. She still didn't cry. But for the first time since her father had spoken those words at the kitchen table, she felt the full weight of what she had walked into. And somewhere down the hall, she heard Clayton Moore set something down on a table, blow out a lamp, and go to bed without a sound. She didn't know yet that the quiet man at the end of the hall was carrying something far heavier than she was. She didn't know yet what that weight was. But she would. The first week passed the way cold mornings do, slow, gray, and without much conversation. Rosalie settled into a routine the way she always had, by filling every hour with something useful. She swept the floors before Clayton was awake. She cooked without being asked. She found the neglected garden on the east side of the house and stood at its edge for a long time, looking at the dry, cracked soil and the ghost of what had once grown there. The outlines of old rows, a rusted hand tool half buried near the fence post, a single stubborn rosemary bush that had survived everything. She went back inside and got a pail. Clayton noticed. She could tell by the way he paused at the kitchen window one morning, coffee in hand, looking out at where she was kneeling in the dirt. He didn't say anything about it. He just finished his coffee and went out to tend the horses. That was how they communicated in those early days, through things left undone and things quietly done, through doors held open and meals eaten without complaint. It wasn't warmth, but it wasn't coldness either. It was something in between that Rosalie didn't have a name for yet. It was the middle of the second week when she first noticed something was wrong with him. She hadn't been looking for it. She wasn't in the habit of watching him closely. She made a point of that, in fact. But she was crossing the yard with a basket of laundry when she saw him stop at the fence post, one hand gripping the top rail. His head dropped forward. He stood like that for a long moment, still, too still. Then he straightened, rolled his shoulder like it was nothing, and kept walking. She said nothing. It wasn't her place. She barely knew this man. But she watched him more carefully after that, in the way you watch something you're not sure you saw correctly. And over the next few days she began to collect small things, the way he sometimes paused on the porch steps before coming inside, the way he ate less than a man his size should, the way he occasionally pressed his hand flat against his ribs when he thought no one was looking. She told herself it was nothing. Men got tired. Men had old injuries. She almost believed it. The first real conversation they had happened by accident. She was up past midnight, unable to sleep, sitting at the kitchen table with a candle and one of the books she'd pulled from his shelf, a worn collection of American poetry that looked like it had been read many times. She hadn't expected to be caught. Clayton appeared in the doorway in his work shirt and boots, like he hadn't been to bed at all. He stopped when he saw her. She looked up. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Couldn't sleep," she said. It wasn't a question or an apology. "Neither," he said. He moved to the stove and put on water for coffee without asking if she wanted any. He set a second cup on the table anyway. She didn't object. He sat down across from her, and for a while they just existed in the same quiet. Then his eyes dropped to the book in her hands. "That one belonged to my mother," he said. She looked down at it. "I should have asked." "No," he said simply. "She would have liked someone reading it." Quote, Rosalie turned the book over in her hands. "She's gone?" Quote, "Long time now." She nodded. She understood that particular kind of long time. The water came to a boil. He got up and poured. When he set her cup down, she noticed his hand tremble, just slightly, just for a second, before he steadied it and sat back down. She looked at her coffee. He looked at the window. Neither of them mentioned it. After that night, something shifted, not dramatically, not in any way she could point to, but the silence between them changed texture. It became less guarded. He started saying good morning when he came in for breakfast. She started leaving the coffee ready. Small things, careful things. One afternoon she came in from the garden to find he had repaired the leg on the kitchen chair that had been wobbling since she arrived. He hadn't mentioned it was broken. She hadn't either. She stood there looking at it for a moment, then went to wash her hands. "Thank you," she said, with her back to him. "It needed doing," he said. She turned around. He was already heading back outside. but she caught just the edge of something on his face before he turned. Not quite a smile, but close to the shape of one. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment after he left. She didn't know what to do with a man like that. It was Janelle who said out loud what Rosalie wouldn't let herself think. Her sister came to visit on a Saturday, bright-eyed and curious in the way only Janelle could be without it feeling rude. She helped shell peas on the porch and watched Clayton cross the yard below them with the careful attention of someone forming an opinion. "He's not what I expected," Janelle said. "What did you expect?" Rosalie asked, without looking up. "I don't know." Something harder. Rosalie didn't respond. Janelle glanced at her sideways. "Rosalie, do you like him?" Quote, "I don't know him." "That's not what I asked." Rosalie set down a pea pod and looked out at the yard. Clayton had stopped near the water trough. That familiar stillness came over him again. Just for a moment, just long enough for her chest to tighten before he moved on. "Something's wrong with him," Rosalie said quietly. "I don't know what, but something is." Janelle followed her gaze. The lightness in her expression settled into something more serious. "Have you asked him?" Quote. Rosalie picked up another pod. "Not yet." Quote. She said it like it was only a matter of time, and she realized, sitting there on the porch of a house she hadn't chosen, that she meant it. That somewhere between the midnight coffee and the repaired chair and the book that had belonged to his mother, she had started to care about the answer. And that frightened her more than the marriage ever had. She asked him on a Wednesday evening. She hadn't planned it for a Wednesday. She hadn't planned it at all, really. But they were sitting on the porch after supper, the sky going orange and pink the way it did out here in a way that almost made the hardness of the land feel worth it, and Clayton coughed. Not a small cough, the kind that came from somewhere deep and didn't want to stop. He turned away from her, one hand on the porch rail, and waited it out. When it passed, he straightened and looked back at the horizon like nothing had happened. "Clayton," she said. "I'm fine. I didn't ask yet." Quote. He was quiet. "How long?" she asked. He didn't pretend not to understand. That was the thing about him she had come to recognize. He didn't perform. He didn't dress things up or play innocent. He just went still for a moment, the way he did when something cost him, and then he answered. "The doctor in Abilene said 8 months, he said." That was 5 months ago. The sky kept going orange. A horse shifted somewhere in the barn. Rosalie sat with those words and didn't say anything for a long time. "Your lungs," she said finally. "Yes." She folded her hands in her lap. "Did Walter Cobb know?" Quote. A pause. He knew. Something moved through her then. Not quite anger, not quite grief. Something that hadn't found its name yet. She thought about her father at the kitchen table. She thought about the dress she'd altered. She thought about the wagon ride north and Clayton's first words to her, "I won't trouble you," and she understood now what he had meant when he said them. He hadn't been offering her distance out of coldness. He had been trying to protect her from exactly this. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the back room and stared at the ceiling and thought about a man who had married a woman he didn't know, knowing he would leave her, knowing she hadn't chosen him, and had spent every day since trying to take up as little of her life as possible. The repaired chair, the cleared room, the coffee cup set down without a word. He had been quietly, carefully, trying not to matter to her, and he had failed. She got up before dawn and started breakfast. When Clayton came in and saw the table set and the eggs already done, he stopped in the doorway. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know," she said. She set down his plate and poured his coffee and sat across from him. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something uncertain, something almost young. "Rosalie, eat your breakfast, Clayton," she said quietly. He did. The weeks that followed were the strangest of her life. She couldn't have explained them to anyone, least of all herself. Nothing dramatic happened. There were no grand declarations, no moments that announced themselves as important. There was just the slow, ordinary accumulation of two people choosing, day after day, to be in the same place. She read to him in the evenings from his mother's poetry book, when the coughing tired him too much to hold the pages himself. He told her about the land, which acres held water longest, where the soil was richest, which fence lines needed watching come spring. She understood what he was doing. He was teaching her how to keep the place after he was gone. She let him, and she listened to every word. One evening he asked her if she had ever wanted to leave Caldwell Creek, go somewhere else entirely. "Once," she said. "When I was about 16, I thought I'd go east, become a schoolteacher somewhere nobody knew my name." "Why didn't you?" Quote. She was quiet for a moment. "My mother got sick, then it just became the way things were." He nodded slowly. "You gave up a lot." "Everyone gives up something," she said. He looked at her then, really looked at her, in the long, careful way he had. "I'm sorry," he said, "for all of it, the way it happened." She met his eyes. "I know you are." "I should have refused Cobb's arrangement. I told myself it was practical. The land needed someone after me. Your father needed help. But the truth is—" He stopped, looked at the window. "I was lonely, and that was selfish." The honesty of it sat between them like something fragile. "Maybe," she said. "But you've been kind to me, Clayton. You've been careful with me." She paused. "That's not nothing." He didn't answer. But when she reached across the table and put her hand over his, he didn't pull away. He declined faster than the doctor had predicted. By the time the leaves turned, he rarely left the house. She moved her things to the room across from his without discussion, so she could hear him in the night. She learned the rhythms of his breathing the way you learn the sounds of a house, which ones were normal, which ones meant she needed to go to him. Her father came to visit once and stood in the doorway of Clayton's room with his hat in his hands, looking like a man carrying something he couldn't set down. Clayton shook his hand and told him the south pasture was good land, and Gerald ought to know that Rosalie had kept everything running better than he ever had. Her father laughed, the painful kind, and left quickly. Rosalie walked him to his wagon. "Rosalie," her father started. "Don't," she said. Not unkindly, just firmly. He nodded and climbed up and drove away. She stood watching until the wagon disappeared, then went back inside. He died on a still morning in late October. She was with him. She had been there through the night, sitting beside the bed in the wooden chair she'd pulled in from the kitchen. He had been mostly quiet for 2 days, drifting in and out, and she had talked to him anyway, about the garden, about the rosemary bush that had somehow made it to fall, about nothing in particular. She didn't know how much he heard. She talked, anyway. Near dawn, he opened his eyes and looked at her clearly, the way he used to across the kitchen table. "You would have liked it," he said, "going east." She took his hand. "Maybe," she said. "But I think I would have missed this land." He almost smiled. The real kind. The one that had taken her weeks to earn. Then he closed his eyes. And the room went very still. They buried him on the hill north of the house, where he had told her the view was best. She stood at the grave while the preacher spoke, and the wind moved through the dry grass, and she thought about a man who had tried so hard not to matter. She thought about midnight coffee and borrowed poetry and a chair leg quietly repaired. She thought about "I won't trouble you." And for the first time since her father had sat her down at the kitchen table and changed the shape of her life, Rosalie Harrington stood in the open air and wept. Not for the marriage she hadn't chosen, not for the life she had given up, but for Clayton Moore, who had loved her in the only way he believed he was allowed to, carefully, quietly, and just long enough to matter. She wept until she couldn't any more. Then she wiped her face, looked out at the land he had left her, and went back to the house. There was a garden that needed tending come spring, and she intended to keep it.